Hashtag a traffic stop's unexpected turn. Hashtag part 1. The stop. The night was quiet on Highway 27, with only the occasional hum of passing cars breaking the silence. Officer Mike Reynolds sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as he watched the traffic through tired eyes. After 15 years on the force, nights like these had become routine, almost boring. The clock on his dashboard read 11:43 p.m. A black SUV caught his attention as it cruised past. The windows were tinted so dark they seemed to absorb the streetlights rather than reflect them. Reynolds straightened in his seat, his interest piqued. Something about the vehicle didn't sit right with him, and he'd learned to trust his instincts over the years. Too dark for legal tint, he muttered to himself, flipping on his patrol car's lights. The SUV continued for a moment before smoothly pulling over to the shoulder, its brake lights glowing like red eyes in the darkness. Reynolds adjusted his body camera, making sure it was recording. It was department policy now, though he'd never been a fan of being watched while he worked. He radioed in the stop, reading off the license plate number. The plate was clean. Registered to a new vehicle, but something still felt off. As he stepped out of his patrol car, Reynolds felt the familiar weight of his gun against his hip. His hand instinctively rested near it, a habit born from years of experience, and though he wouldn't admit it, his own prejudices. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the SUV's rear window. The vehicle was immaculate, not a speck of dust on its surface. Even the license plate looked freshly cleaned. Reynolds approached with measured steps, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. Each step was accompanied by the quiet jingling of his equipment belt. Probably some gang member, he thought to himself, already constructing a narrative in his mind. He'd seen it plenty of times before, expensive cars, dark windows, driving through this part of town late at night. The story always seemed to end the same way. The air felt different as he got closer to the SUV, slightly warmer, with a faint electric charge that made the hair on his arms stand up. He dismissed it as static electricity from his polyester uniform. Driver's license and registration, Reynolds called out, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he'd perfected over years of traffic stops. He stood slightly behind the driver's door, positioning himself as he'd been trained, ready to react to any sudden movements. No response came from inside the vehicle. I said, driver's license and registration, he repeated, louder this time, shining his flashlight directly at the driver's window. The beam seemed to bend slightly around the glass, creating strange patterns in the darkness. Reynolds felt his patience wearing thin. Every passing second of silence increased his suspicion, fueled by years of ingrained biases and what he called street smarts. Step out of the vehicle now, he commanded, his hand moving closer to his weapon. His heart rate picked up, the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with potentially dangerous situations. The window began to roll down with a soft whirring sound. Reynolds tensed, expecting trouble. The glass descended smoothly, revealing the interior inch by inch. His flashlight beam penetrated the darkness inside, illuminating what appeared to be a tall figure in the driver's seat. The beam caught what should have been skin, but instead of reflecting light normally, it seemed to ripple like the surface of dark water. Reynolds blinked hard, wondering if his eyes were playing tricks on him after too many hours on patrol. "Good evening, officer," came a voice from inside, deep, clear, and somehow both familiar and completely alien at the same time. "I believe we need to have a conversation about your approach to traffic stops." Reynolds stood frozen, his flashlight beam steadily revealing more details that his brain struggled to process. This wasn't going to be a routine traffic stop after all, and everything he thought he knew was about to change. Hashtag a traffic stop's unexpected turn. Hashtag part 2, first contact. Officer Reynolds gripped his flashlight tighter, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure in the driver's seat was tall, too tall for the SUV's interior. Yet somehow they seemed to fit perfectly, as if the space inside had expanded to accommodate their height. "Your heart rate is elevated, Officer Reynolds," the figure said, their voice carrying a hint of concern. "Please, there's no need for alarm. I'm simply here to talk." Reynolds took an instinctive step backward. "How do you know my name?" His free hand hovered near his weapon, though some deep instinct told him it would be useless. The figure turned to face him fully, and Reynolds felt his world tilt sideways. Where there should have been a face, there was something that shifted and moved like oil on water. Dark skin seemed to ripple and change, catching the flashlight's beam and breaking it into impossible colors. "Your name badge," the figure said simply, gesturing with what might have been a hand. "And your body camera is functioning perfectly, by the way. We want everything recorded." Reynolds glanced down at his badge, then back at the figure. His training hadn't prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for this. "Step out of the vehicle," he said automatically, falling back on procedure because it was all he had. Of course. The door opened smoothly and the figure emerged. They unfolded to their full height, at least 7 feet tall, their form seeming to absorb the surrounding light. Their suit, which had appeared normal at first glance, now seemed to be made of living shadow. What are you?" Reynolds managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. "That's a complex question," the figure replied, their tone friendly. "Let's say I'm a concerned party interested in humanity's progress, or lack thereof in some cases." They gestured at Reynolds' hand, still hovering near his gun. Traffic continued to pass on the highway, headlights occasionally washing over them. Strangely, none of the cars seemed to slow down or notice anything unusual about the scene. It was as if they were in a bubble of privacy invisible to the outside world. "You were expecting someone different when you pulled me over, weren't you?" the figure asked. "Someone who matched your preconceptions." Reynolds felt heat rise to his face. "I was just doing my job." "The windows are too dark. It's a violation." "Are they?" The figure ran a rippling hand along the SUV's surface. "Or did you see what you expected to see? What you wanted to see?" The air grew thicker, charged with an energy that made Reynolds' skin tingle. The figure's form continued to shift and change, cycling through different human appearances, each one lasting just long enough to be recognized before morphing into the next. "We've been watching, Officer Reynolds, watching and learning. Your species has such potential, yet you let such small differences divide you. Differences in appearance, in beliefs, in background." The figure's voice remained calm, but carried an weight that seemed to press against Reynolds' chest. "Who's we?" Reynolds asked, finding his voice again. His flashlight beam still bounced off the figure's surface in impossible ways, creating patterns that hurt his eyes if he looked too long. "Let's call us the observers for now. We have a particular interest in how humans treat each other. It's quite relevant to your species' future, more than you might imagine." A car passed by, its headlights illuminating the scene. For just a moment, Reynolds saw the figure's true form reflected in the SUV's window, something his mind couldn't quite grasp, geometry that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. "This isn't a normal traffic stop, is it?" Reynolds asked, finally lowering his flashlight. The figure's surface rippled with what might have been amusement. "No, Officer Reynolds, it isn't. In fact, you could say this stop was arranged specifically for you. We need to have a serious discussion about your approach to law enforcement and what it means for humanity's place in a much larger community." Reynolds glanced at his body camera, then back at the figure. "I'm listening," he said, and for the first time in his career he truly was. #A traffic stop's unexpected turn. ## Part 3. The Revelation. The night air grew warmer as Officer Reynolds stood facing the impossible being before him. His body camera continued recording, its small red light blinking steadily in the darkness. "Let me show you something," the figure said, raising what appeared to be a hand. The air between them shimmered, and suddenly they were surrounded by floating images, scenes from traffic stops across the country. Each one showed officers interacting with civilians, some peaceful, others tense and confrontational. "We've been monitoring these interactions for decades," the figure explained. Their voice had changed, becoming more formal. "I am what you might call an ambassador from the Galactic Council. We oversee the development of emerging civilizations." Reynolds watched the floating images, recognizing some of the locations. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because, Officer Reynolds, humanity stands at a crossroads." The ambassador gestured, and the images changed to show vast cities unlike anything on Earth, gleaming towers that stretched into the clouds, vehicles that flew between them like silverfish. "This could be Earth's future. Your species has the potential to join a community of civilizations that spans the galaxy." "But," Reynolds asked, sensing there was more. But potential isn't enough. The ambassador's form shifted, briefly taking on the appearance of various people Reynolds had pulled over during his career. We evaluate civilizations not just on their technological progress, but on their social development, how they treat their own kind, especially those with power, like yourself. The weight of those words hit Reynolds like a physical force. He thought about all the traffic stops he'd made, all the assumptions he acted on. You're saying my actions, our actions, could keep humanity from all this? Precisely. The ambassador waved their hand again, and the images disappeared, leaving them in the normal night air. Every interaction we've observed, every decision made based on prejudice rather than reason, every abuse of power, it all factors into our evaluation. The ambassador moved closer to Reynolds' patrol car, their form rippling in the red and blue lights that still flashed silently. Your body camera isn't just recording for your department tonight, Officer Reynolds. This entire interaction is being broadcast live to the Galactic Council. Reynolds felt his stomach drop. The whole thing? From the moment you decided to pull over my vehicle. Tell me, why did you really make that decision? What made you suspect this particular SUV? Reynolds opened his mouth to cite the window tint violation, but the words died in his throat. He thought about his real reasons, the assumptions he'd made, the profile he'd built in his mind before he'd even seen the driver. That's what I thought, the ambassador said softly. Their form stabilized briefly into something almost human, but with eyes that seemed to hold entire galaxies. But don't misunderstand, this isn't about shame or punishment, this is about potential. They reached into the SUV and pulled out what looked like a small crystal. As they held it up, it projected a hologram of Earth, spinning slowly in the night air. Your planet is capable of amazing things, Officer Reynolds. Your species could explore the stars, cure diseases that have plagued you for millennia, end the scarcity that drives so much of your conflict. The hologram changed, showing scenes of humans working alongside beings of clearly alien origin, sharing knowledge, building wonders Reynolds could hardly comprehend. But first, the ambassador continued, you need to overcome these artificial divisions you've created among yourselves. These prejudices that lead someone like you, a person sworn to protect and serve, to make decisions based on fear and bias rather than justice and reason. Reynolds stared at his reflection in the SUV's window, seeing himself clearly perhaps for the first time in years. Why me? He asked finally. Why show all this to me? The ambassador's form shifted one final time, settling into a mirror image of Reynolds himself. Because, Officer Reynolds, change has to start somewhere. And tonight it starts with you. Hashtag a traffic stop's unexpected turn. Hashtag part 4, the test. Officer Reynolds watched as the ambassador walked in a slow circle around the patrol car, their form shifting like smoke in the wind. Each step left brief traces of light on the asphalt that faded after a few seconds. What you're about to see, the ambassador said, stopping at the car's hood, is something we show to all potential member species. Consider it a glimpse of what's at stake. They placed their hand on the patrol car's hood, and suddenly Reynolds wasn't standing on Highway 27 anymore. The world around him had changed completely. He found himself floating in what appeared to be space, but he could breathe normally. Below him, Earth spun slowly, beautiful and blue. But something was wrong. Dark patches spread across the continents like bruises, and streams of vehicles were leaving the atmosphere, people fleeing. This is one possible future, the ambassador's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. 50 years from now, if humanity continues on its current path, divided, suspicious, afraid of differences rather than celebrating them. The scene changed. Reynolds was now standing in a city street. The buildings were crumbling, and people hurried past with their heads down, avoiding eye contact. Police officers stood on every corner, their uniforms more military than law enforcement, weapons held ready. Your profession becomes something else entirely, the ambassador explained as they appeared beside him. Not protectors, but oppressors. Fear leads to control. Control leads to resistance. Resistance leads to violence. Reynolds watched as the scene played out, a traffic stop much like the one he'd just conducted, but ending in tragedy. His stomach turned. Stop, he said quietly. I've seen enough of this version. The scene shifted again. Now they stood in the same street, but everything was different. The buildings gleamed with clean energy technology, and people of all backgrounds moved freely, talking and laughing together. Police officers walked among them, their uniforms light and approachable, clearly peace officers rather than warriors. This is the same year, the ambassador said, but a different path. One where humanity learned to see past surface differences, where law enforcement became true guardians of peace, not agents of fear. They watched as another traffic stop played out. The officer approached the vehicle with respect, not suspicion. The interaction ended with smiles and waves. Your species stands at a tipping point, Officer Reynolds, and you, specifically, are being tested right now. The scene disappeared, and they were back on Highway 27. Reynolds' body camera was still recording, its red light a reminder that the Galactic Council was watching. Tested? Reynolds asked, his voice rough. Why me? The ambassador's form stabilized into something more solid, though still not quite human. Because you represent a crucial factor in human development. Law enforcement shapes society's trust and cooperation levels. Your daily decisions impact hundreds of lives, and those impacts ripple outward. They gestured to the passing traffic on the highway. Every interaction you have is a chance to build trust or create fear, to unite or divide, to move humanity toward one future or another. Reynolds thought about his 15 years on the force, about all the traffic stops he conducted. How many had been based on real violations, and how many on his own prejudices? The test isn't over, the ambassador continued. In fact, it's just beginning. We're going to watch you, Officer Reynolds. Every stop, every interaction, every decision, not to judge, but to measure humanity's readiness for a larger role in the galaxy. They turned to face him fully, their form now a perfect mirror of himself again. The question is, knowing what you know now, seeing what you've seen, how will you change? Will you help lead your species toward a better future, or remain part of what holds it back? Reynolds looked down at his badge, thinking about what it was supposed to represent. Protection, service, justice, not fear or control. The next traffic stop you make, the ambassador said quietly, will be the first test, and Officer Reynolds, the whole galaxy will be watching. #A traffic stop's unexpected turn. ## Part 5. The choice. The weight of the moment pressed down on Officer Reynolds as he stood in the pool of his patrol car's flashing lights. The choice before him seemed both simple and impossibly complex at the same time. You don't have to decide right now, the ambassador said, their form shifting to match the red and blue lights. But every moment you wait is a moment humanity stays stuck in its current path. Reynolds walked to his patrol car and leaned against the hood, his mind bracing. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm just one cop in a small town. How can I possibly make a difference big enough to matter? The ambassador moved beside him, their presence causing the air to hum with energy. Let me show you something else. They raised their hand, and the air in front of them became like a screen. Images began to play. Reynolds' future if he chose to continue as he was. He saw himself growing more bitter, more suspicious, his prejudices hardening into hatred. Young officers following his example, learning to fear instead of protect. The ripples of his actions spreading outward, affecting thousands of lives over the years. Now look at this, the ambassador said softly. The images changed. Reynolds saw himself in the police station, speaking to his fellow officers about his experience tonight. At first they laughed and didn't believe him. But then they saw the changes in how he worked, how he treated people. They saw his stop numbers go down, but his successful interventions go up. They saw the community beginning to trust him. Small changes, Officer Reynolds, the ambassador explained, but they spread. Like ripples in a pond, growing larger as they move outward. The images showed more. Reynolds becoming a training officer, teaching new recruits about looking past prejudices. Him speaking at police academies about community trust. Other departments adopting his methods. The ripples growing into waves of change. But it won't be easy, Reynolds said, watching the scenes play out. There will be resistance. People don't like change. The ambassador's form solidified slightly. No, they don't. You'll face skepticism, ridicule, and possibly worse. Some will call you a traitor to the badge. Others will say you've gone soft. The question is, Are you willing to face that for the sake of something larger than yourself? Reynolds thought about his own father, also a cop, and the attitudes he'd inherited. He thought about all the times he'd pulled someone over because they looked suspicious, code words for prejudices he'd never fully acknowledged. "What if I fail?" he asked quietly. "What if you succeed?" the ambassador countered. "What if your choice tonight becomes the pebble that starts an avalanche of change?" Besides, they added, their form shifting to show all the faces of people Reynolds had stopped over the years. "You've already seen what failure looks like. You've been living it." Reynolds stood up straight, feeling the familiar weight of his badge and gun. But now they felt different, like symbols of responsibility rather than power. "If I do this," he said slowly, "if I choose to change, will you help me? Guide me?" The ambassador's form rippled with what seemed like approval. "We can't interfere directly. That would defeat the purpose of the test. But we will be watching. And sometimes knowing you're being watched is help enough." They held out their hand, a surprisingly human gesture from such an alien being. "So, Officer Reynolds, what's your choice? Continue as you are, letting your prejudices guide your actions, or become something more? Help humanity remain trapped in its current cycle, or help lead it toward a greater destiny?" Reynolds looked at the offered hand, then at his reflection in the SUV's window. He saw himself not as he was, but as he could be. The choice suddenly seemed very clear. He reached out and took the ambassador's hand. The moment their hands touched, Reynolds felt a surge of energy course through him. Not physical power, but something deeper, understanding, empathy, and purpose all mixed together. "Well then," the ambassador said, that form glowing slightly in the darkness, "let's begin." #A traffic stop's unexpected turn. ## Part 6. The change. The next few months passed like a whirlwind for Officer Reynolds. Each day brought new challenges and opportunities to prove his commitment to change. His first test came the very next night after his encounter with the ambassador. He'd pulled over a car for a broken taillight. In the past, seeing the driver was a young man with tattoos would have put him on edge, made him suspicious. Instead, Reynolds approached with a smile, explaining the reason for the stop calmly. He ended up helping the man schedule a repair at a local shop that offered discounted services. "You're different lately, Mike," his partner Tom said one morning over coffee in the break room. "Everything okay?" Reynolds looked at his reflection in the coffee pot, the same face, but somehow changed. "Just seeing things clearer now," he replied, remembering the ambassador's words about being watched. The harder moments came during department meetings. When other officers made comments based on prejudice, Reynolds spoke up instead of staying silent. Some officers stopped talking to him. Others called him soft, but a few, especially the younger ones, started listening. One rainy evening, Reynolds was reviewing his body camera footage from the night of his encounter with the ambassador. The recording showed everything, but to his surprise, the ambassador appeared completely normal on video, just a tall person in a suit. The true nature of their appearance had been visible only to him. As he watched, a shadow fell across his desk. He looked up to see a young woman he didn't recognize. "Interesting footage," she said, her voice carrying a familiar otherworldly tone that made the hair on his arms stand up. The ambassador in a new form. "Checking up on me?" Reynolds asked quietly, making sure no one else was around. "Always watching, remember?" They smiled. "You've made impressive progress. That incident last week with the protest, you handled it well." Reynolds nodded, remembering how he diffused a tense situation between protesters and counter-protesters before it could turn violent. Instead of choosing sides, he'd facilitated dialogue. It had made the local news. "The council is particularly interested in how you're influencing others," the ambassador continued. "Your example is spreading." They waved their hand, and the air between them briefly showed scenes from across the country. Other police officers making similar changes, departments revising their training programs, communities beginning to heal decades-old wounds of distrust. All because of one traffic stop? Reynolds asked, still amazed by the ripple effects. The ambassador's form flickered slightly. The right change at the right moment can shift the course of history. Your species understands this. You call it the butterfly effect. Reynolds thought about his next training session with new recruits. He'd been developing a program about conscious bias and community trust. The chief had been skeptical at first, but couldn't argue with the results. Complaints down, community cooperation up. There are others like me out there, aren't there? He asked suddenly. Other officers having similar encounters. The ambassador's smile held secrets of distant stars. Change rarely happens in isolation, Officer Reynolds. Let's just say you're not alone in being tested. They moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. Humanity's evaluation continues, but early results are promising. Your changes here have inspired similar changes in departments across the country. Small adjustments in attitude and approach that add up to significant shifts in community relations. And the council? Reynolds asked. What do they think? They think, the ambassador said, their form beginning to fade. That hope is a powerful force for change. Keep going, Officer Reynolds. Keep showing others the way. We'll be watching. As they disappeared completely, Reynolds turned back to his desk. On top of his paperwork lay a small crystal, similar to the one the ambassador had shown him that first night. When he picked it up, it hummed with energy and showed him a brief glimpse of Earth as seen from space. Peaceful, united, and ready for its place among the stars. Hashtag a traffic stop's unexpected turn. Hashtag part 7, the aftermath. 1 year had passed since that fateful night on Highway 27. Officer Mike Reynolds sat in his patrol car, now parked in front of the local community center. The building buzzed with activity. It was graduation day for the first class of his new police training program. Inside his pocket, the small crystal the ambassador had left him hummed warmly. It did that sometimes, usually when he was about to make an important decision or when he'd handled a situation particularly well. He'd come to think of it as a kind of cosmic approval. As he walked into the community center, he passed a wall of news articles. Local police department sets new standard for community relations, read one headline. Officers' revolutionary training program spreads nationwide, declared another. Reynolds smiled, remembering how it all started with one traffic stop. The graduation ceremony was small but significant. 20 officers from departments across the state sat in their chairs, ready to take what they'd learned back to their own communities. In the audience, he spotted several familiar faces, or at least faces that appeared familiar. A tall woman in a business suit nodded to him from the back row, her skin seeming to shimmer slightly under the fluorescent lights. Next to her, a teenager with unusually bright eyes gave him a knowing smile. 2 rows ahead, an elderly man's form rippled almost imperceptibly. The ambassadors were everywhere, watching, evaluating. When I started this program, Reynolds began his speech, looking out at the graduates. People said I was trying to change too much too fast. They said police work was police work, and that's all there was to it. But they were wrong. He pulled out his body camera, the same one he'd worn that night a year ago. This camera doesn't just record what we do, it records who we are. Every interaction, every decision, every moment of prejudice or compassion, it's all there. And not just for our departments to see, but for everyone. The crystal in his pocket hummed stronger as he continued. We're not just law enforcement officers, we're guardians of our community's future. Every traffic stop, every interaction, every choice we make, they're all tests. Tests of our character, our compassion, our capacity to grow. As he spoke, the lights in the room seemed to pulse gently, unnoticed by most of the audience. The air took on that familiar electric quality he first felt a year ago. What we do matters more than we know, he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. Our actions today shape not just our communities, but humanity's future. And let me tell you, the whole world is watching. After the ceremony, Reynolds walked back to his patrol car. The night air was warm, just like it had been a year ago. As he reached for his door handle, a familiar voice spoke behind him. Well done, Officer Reynolds. The original ambassador stood there in the same form they'd worn during their first meeting. The council is most impressed with your progress. Reynolds smiled. Not just my progress, I hope. There are good people out there making good changes. Indeed. The ambassador's form shifted through various human appearances. Humanity's evaluation has taken a remarkable turn this past year. Your species is showing great promise. Enough promise for membership in the Galactic Council? Reynolds asked. The ambassador's form settled into a mirror image of Reynolds again. That remains to be seen. But for the first time, we're seeing real hope. The ripples of change are becoming waves. Keep going, Officer Reynolds. Keep teaching, keep growing, keep changing. They began to fade away, their voice becoming distant. And remember, we're always watching. Reynolds got into his patrol car and started his shift. His radio crackled with a call about a traffic violation on Highway 27. As he pulled out onto the road, the crystal in his pocket hummed warmly. 1 year ago, a traffic stop had changed his life and set humanity on a new path. Tonight, somewhere out there, another officer might be facing their own test. The future was watching, and humanity was finally ready to face it.